Welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. And now, here's Chris McCann.
Good evening and welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Bible study in the book of Genesis. Tonight is study number 3 in Genesis chapter 39, and we'll begin reading from verse 1. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And Jehovah was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that Jehovah was with him, and that Jehovah made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. And it came to pass, from the time that he had made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, that Jehovah blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake, and the blessing of Jehovah was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. And I'll stop reading there. Okay, in our last study, we were talking about Potiphar, and we looked at the fact he was an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, and an Egyptian, and we saw how he was a very high-ranking individual in the kingdom of Egypt, a very powerful man with great authority, but we didn't really discuss who he represents. I'm sure you're getting some ideas, because as we discussed him, there are certain clues. Yet we're not going to get into that right now. Lord willing, in a future study, we'll look at the spiritual meaning of this whole thing. But right now, let's look at what God says of Joseph, who, again, he's a teenager. He was 17 years old, and he was betrayed by his own brothers, sold as a slave to the Midianite merchantmen, and brought down to Egypt, sold to Potiphar, and then we read this language in verse 2, Jehovah was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And again in verse 3, and his master saw that Jehovah was with him, and that Jehovah made all that he did to prosper in his hand. That's twice Joseph is said to be a prosperous man, and all that he did prospered. It's really amazing that this is said of this young man while he is a slave in Potiphar's house. But even more than that, if we go to the close of this chapter in verses 21 through 23, we read there, but Jehovah was with Joseph. You notice that was said in the other two verses also. In verse 2, Jehovah was with Joseph. Verse 3, Jehovah was with him, meaning Joseph. And here again in verse 21, but Jehovah was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And, by this time we know the story that Joseph's master, due to his wife's accusation against Joseph, throws him into prison. So it went from our perspective, from bad to worse for Joseph, and things were pretty bad already. And now he's in the prison, and yet God is still with him. And again, verse 21, showed him mercy, gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. And whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because Jehovah was with him, and that which he did, Jehovah made it to prosper. Again, Jehovah's with him, and then we read that which Joseph did, Jehovah made it to prosper. That's why he's a prosperous man, because God is making whatever he does to prosper. And it is noticeable. It was noticeable to Potiphar. It's noticeable now to the keeper of the prison, a different man. And they then basically give Joseph power and authority, and all goes well. All goes well. So it's an amazing thing, because we would expect, if you're looking at this from the world's perspective, that there is no prosperity in being a servant, a slave, after having been basically shanghaied or kidnapped and sold as a slave by your own brethren, and then you're in a man's house who has bought you, and you're no longer your own. You've been bought with a price, and you are not your own person, and yet still God says Joseph was prosperous. He was a prosperous man in that condition, in that situation. And even more astounding, when he then is betrayed and placed in prison. And again, God made everything he did to prosper. He is a prosperous man, very different. The world would not look at Joseph in those situations and say he was prosperous in any way. The poor man, he's at the bottom. He's the lowest of the low. When you're a slave, and a slave in prison to boot, he's not making any money. He's not well respected in the world. Where is his prosperity? Well, his prosperity is with God. So I want to look at this word that's translated as prosper here. If we go to Psalm 118 verses 24 and 25, it says there, "This is the day which Jehovah hath made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. Save now, I beseech thee, O Jehovah. O Jehovah, I beseech thee. Send now prosperity. Save now, O Jehovah, I beseech thee." And then send now prosperity. And so here God is tying together saving, or his salvation, with prosperity. If someone becomes saved, then they obtain prosperity. Why? Because God is with them. Emmanuel, God with us. And we know Emmanuel is the Lord Jesus Christ. When God saves the sinner, and that sinner becomes a complete new creature with a new heart and a new spirit, and also with the Spirit of God now indwelling him, God with him, he has become a prosperous man or woman. He has become a prosperous individual because of God's salvation. He has now everything that is truly needful, even though, like Joseph and like many of God's people down through the centuries and down through history, maybe they didn't have any money, maybe they didn't have any success in the eyes of the world, they didn't climb the ladder and weren't looked up to by others in the world. Yeah, that's true. So by the world's standard, as they look at God's people, often God's people do not measure up. They're not anything. They're nothing. And sometimes they're so despised because they are God's people. They're viewed as being lowly, kind of like a beggar, like Lazarus. And remember that account in that parable that the Lord Jesus Christ told of the rich man and Lazarus. And if there is ever, an illustration that would describe the world's idea of prosperity over against God's idea of prosperity, it's that parable, because we read in Luke chapter 16, it says in verse 19, there was a certain rich man which was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. Wow, what a successful man. What a prosperous man this rich man is. First of all, he's a rich man, which means he has lots of money. And when you have lots of money, you have lots of nice things. So he has a very big house, more than likely, very well kept and decorated, and people walk by his house and think, oh, one day I'd like to have a house like that. Oh, but I know it'll never happen. And so people would envy the rich man for his things, for his house, for his food, and for his clothing, dressed in purple and fine linen. He had the finest of clothing. It stood out whenever he walked down the street. Everyone knew he's a rich man. The rest of the people, or most of the other people, they had very plain clothing that didn't indicate wealth at all. It was clothing that that probably signified a much lower status, and yet the rich man's clothing, it told everyone, this is a wealthy man, this is an important man, this is a powerful man, this is a man to be respected. He's to be respected. He has everything that we want, that the world would lift up and uphold as this is what life is all about. This is why we live, to obtain and to get and to grab a hold of the things of the world. And so his wealth has enabled that, and he's reached that pinnacle. He is a rich man, clothed in purple and fine linen, and he fared sumptuously every day. He has, the finest of food, and much of it, so he can eat to his satisfaction and leave some on the table, or even the crumbs that fall from his table. And that's where Lazarus comes in. Lazarus is not a rich man. As a matter of fact, he's the total opposite of the rich man. And God tells us in Luke 16, verse 20, and there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, which was laid at his gate full of sores, and desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. Now, Lazarus, he doesn't have anything, apparently. He certainly doesn't have all the food of the rich man. He doesn't have the wealth of the rich man. He has to beg. He has to beg to get any money to sustain himself, to purchase a little food. And he would even desire to eat the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. And he has no money to cleanse himself or to see a doctor to take care of his wounds. And he's out on the street where the dogs are wandering around, and the dogs even lick his sores. And so we see a pitiful case, extremely sad and just heartbreaking when we look at Lazarus. Lazarus is anything but a prosperous man. And the world would, without question, draw that conclusion. Oh no, prosperity, are you kidding? Are you kidding? No, look over there to that house where the rich man is. If you want a definition of prosperous and a definition of someone who is successful and who has made it. Oh, and by the way, if we go to, we'll come back here, but if we turn to Joshua chapter 1, I'll read from verse 6. It says there, "Be strong and of a good courage, for unto this people shalt thou divide for an inheritance the land which I swear unto their fathers to give them. Only be thou strong and very courageous, that thou mayest observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded thee. Turn not from it to the right hand or to the left, that thou mayest prosper whithersoever thou goest." Now that's a different word, prosper, but it still is really giving that kind of idea. In verse 8 of Joshua 1, "This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, that thou mayest observe to do according to all that is written therein. For then thou shalt make thy way prosperous." That's our word from Genesis 39. Same word. Joseph was a prosperous man. And notice the context here. The book of the law will not depart out of your mouth. You'll meditate upon it day and night and observe to do according to all that's written therein. And of course, who can do that but someone who has become saved and received a new heart and a new spirit, and then God is with them. And so the conclusion, "For then thou shalt make thy way prosperous, and then thou shalt have good success." The word success is the same word that was translated as prosper in verse 7. "So then thou shalt have good success. Have not I commanded thee? Be strong and of a good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for Jehovah thy God is with thee whithersoever thou goest." You see, the prosperous man, the man who will have good success, nothing to do with things, nothing to do with gold and silver or money, nothing to do with big houses or, chariots in that day, or horses, or any of the luxuries of our day. Nothing to do with any of that. That is not what the Bible looks at when it is looking at a prosperous person and a successful person. And, we're bombarded still in this late date of the world's continuing existence, as we're almost at its end. But we're still bombarded with people out there telling you how to be prosperous, how to be successful in your life, and then they show you how you can make it. Get this degree, take this program and obtain this certificate, or follow this financial formula, and do this and do that, and you will make it. You'll have the money, you'll have the excellent job, the excellent pay, the excellent things that accompany it, and you'll be successful. Yes, you'll be successful as the rich man in Luke chapter 16. That's who you'll be as successful as if you go that route. If that is your desire, if that is what your life is about, if that is the thing that you are pursuing and lusting after and desirous of, you're putting your effort strongly into those things, it is guaranteed, will be certainly as successful as the rich man in Luke chapter 16. But let's see what God has to say, because you will be successful as the rich man, and you will avoid the poverty of the beggar Lazarus if you go after the world's things. And of course, not everybody who goes after the world's things obtains them. But let's give you that. Let's say you actually get a hold of some of them. Yet here, that's the world's perspective. The world looking at it with its limitations, with its temporalness, with its finite setting of this world. And that is the outward observation of people all around us, which is why people are fools. They have such limited sight or foresight into things. They can't look into the heart of man. They can't see spiritual realities in their natural condition, natural fallen condition. But God has his own perspective, and now he's going to give us the perspective from his vantage point, which is an eternal perspective. And he looks beyond the day, and he looks into the things that are to come. And so we read here in Luke 16, after God told us of the rich man's case, and then the beggar Lazarus, who desired to be fed with crumbs, in verse 21, and the dogs licked his swords. And then we read in verse 22, and it came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by angels into Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. Well, there you have perhaps the one thing that being a wealthy man might grant you. It might not, but it might grant you a slightly longer life than the beggar. In this case, it's almost simultaneous. Or we do read that Lazarus is the first one, we're told, that died. The rich man also died. 5 seconds later, 5 minutes later, 5 days later, 5 years later. What does it matter? What does it matter? Even if it's 50 years later, what does it matter? Because they both died. But it's not. It's very close in time according to this. And both die. Now God is going to lift a veil of perspective. He's going to give us the perspective on these two men's lives from his vantage point. And we read, after saying the rich man also died and was buried, in verse 23, and in hell he lift up his eyes, being in torments, and seeth Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that thou in thy lifetime receivest thy good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things. But now he is comforted, and thou art tormented. You see the difference, the incredibly huge difference from the life they lived in the world when they were in their physical bodies and what has taken place after they die. Now the rich man who received good things in his lifetime is tormented, And Lazarus, who received evil things in his lifetime, is comforted. And now we can see Lazarus's prosperity. We can see the fact that he has comfort, whereas the rich man has torment. And Lazarus is with Father Abraham, who represents God. Lazarus is with God. You see, that was the key distinction, wasn't it? When we read of Joseph, Jehovah was with him. Jehovah was with him. When we read in Joshua, in that passage, Joshua 1, 6 through 9, Jehovah will be with you. God will be with you. And although we didn't know it through the outward observation of seeing this beggar Lazarus, but obviously God was with him while he lived and suffered those evil things. And the wondrous, beautiful, glorious, enormous truth about that is that if God is with you while you live, he will be with you after you die. And so Lazarus was in Abraham's bosom. God was with him, and God will be with him forevermore. According to Revelation chapter 21, we read in verse 3, "And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them and be their God." And so the prosperity of Lazarus, which was only understood in words of a book, in belief through faith, he knew he was prosperous deep down in his heart, in his soul, because God was with him while he lived. That prosperity will show itself after he has died, or after he has passed from this life and gone into that life. It will show itself more and more forever into eternity future. The prosperity of Lazarus cannot be calculated. It is unspeakable. It is beyond imagination. It is so great. His riches and the abundance of them are so tremendous that no one could ever figure them. No one could ever write them down. And they will again continue on and on and on with his eternal life. But the rich man will come to his end, and he will be gone forever, and all of his good things, that's it. That's it. The things he had while he lived, the things of the world that God warned not to love the things of the world, not to seek after them or pursue them or treasure them up, because then you would be as a fool, because they perish and they're gone from you forever. Once you die, they are gone, and then what do you have? You have nothing, and there's no prosperity in that.
Thank you for joining us for eBible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies and information, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. Until our next Bible study, may the Lord's perfect will be done.